Hey everybody, it's Axel and Andy. We're here with Hank Idsinga, Inspector, Unit Commander of Homicide, Toronto Police Service on 24 Shades of Blue. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks for joining us.
If everybody who's listening and everybody's watching on video, I'm looking dead into his eyes and I can see that he could interview me very well. You mentioned to us, earlier that you don't like the word interrogation. Could you talk more about that?
I really think it's a American TV type term, and we interview people, and rarely will it turn into that prototypical interrogation type scenario. So I really prefer the term interview, whether it be a witness, a victim, or an accused that we're talking to.
Do you ever just, watch any Netflix shows and say, I could solve this on my own?
I don't watch too much TV, and Netflix, I'm usually at the mercy of my daughter or my wife as to what's on. But I do like 48 Hours.
Okay, nice.
And once in a while, I'll be watching that and think, oh, you've got to do this or you've got to do that, right? But usually they show the solved cases on those shows, right? So it tends to flow quite nicely.
Oh, so most of them are realistic then, would you say?
I would say 48 Hours is obviously very realistic. It's a different world south of the border as to what they can do and what they can't do as opposed to what we can do up here. But a lot of it is very good, so...
So very close. It's very much on point for the most part. Did they use homicide detectives to bounce ideas off of? Do you think, or is that? I'm sure winging it.
48 Hours actually follows live homicide investigations.
Okay.
And I'm sure but it's condensed into 44 minutes.
Yeah,
right? A murder investigation. Which is never the case. And the whole premise of the show is if you don't have that lead within 48 hours, it reduces your probability of solving that murder. So like I said, rarely will they show an unsolved case on there. But sometimes they do show cases that have carried on for months, and they do condense that into 44 minutes.
There's a whole show about unsolved mysteries, and that's what I just pictured when I heard about Hank. I'm like, oh, okay, is this guy just sitting there going, I know exactly what's gonna happen?
and I have to ask this. I guess I'm a big horror movie guy. Do you watch horror movies, or do you kind of stay away from those? Because you've probably seen some real life horror movies, I imagine. What's your take on horror flicks? Is that a sheer morbid curiosity?
Well, it's a fascinating time of year to ask that question, right?
That's right.
Because all the networks are showing the horror movies now, and I will confess I've watched I think one of the Halloween shows.
Mike Myers,
Mike Myers, the original Friday the 13th was on, and I watched that, but it's not so much for the entertainment. It's more nostalgic for me because those are 1980s movies, right? And I remember when they first came out, right? and grew up with those. So but other than that, like I said, if I'm watching any TV, it's usually some of those A&E shows like 48 Hours, and whatever my wife or daughter wants to watch on Netflix.
Forced TV watch.
You're a good father and husband. I mean, especially with things that are, very press-worthy. One of the things we want to talk about was, the MacArthur investigation, and, that was huge all over Toronto. How was leading that?
Canada.
All over Canada, yeah. I was scared to go, planting and go dig up something. What? Tell us about that experience for you, and how the whole Toronto Police handled that as well.
Yeah, that's one of those cases where there's so much going on that the public's not aware of. A lot of work being done by a lot of investigators from the Toronto Police Service. Over years since that first missing person in 2010, and really coming to fruition in 2017, in the summer of 2017. And investigatively, I played a very small role in that investigation, right? There were a lot of people working on it. And as it evolved through the summer and fall of 2017, I was being updated on what was going on and doing a little bit of the steering. But the day that the key piece of evidence was found wasn't until January of 2018. And on that day, it became a real full-time, around-the-clock, 24/7 job for not just myself, but a lot of the investigators on the team. And that carried on well into the midsummer of 2018. 2018, until we found the final set of remains and could account for all 8 of those victims. So 2018 really was a whirlwind, and I had to put a lot of other things aside for the first 6-7 months of that. And ultimately, my main role was being that media liaison for that case, which I think the city really needed, that constant updating and that constant information.
Absolutely. And I think, you touch upon it. A lot of the public is missing out on specific aspects. Could you go deeper into what we're not seeing, or what is the work actually being done, to help solve these cases that the general public doesn't know about? What are those things, so we can help empathize with what's going on?
Well, I can, I don't want to jump from case to case, but if you look at the recent cold case resolution of the Christine Jessup investigation, and there have been some media outlets over the years that have really made a franchise of being critical of nothing being done on that investigation. But in the meantime, in the background, there is so much being done.
Time.
And the amount of work that those investigators put into that case over the years is just phenomenal. And then at the end of the day, we have this resolution, and some people are surprised. They're like, wow, we didn't realize how much work you guys actually were putting into that, and we can't always talk about it. We can't compromise some of those investigations. I like to be as open as I possibly can, and let people know what we're doing.
Does that ever frustrate you? In terms of people not understanding the type of work? It frustrates me whenever I'm on set and film, and they don't know that there's maybe 10 people for one specific thing, and you have to explain that. And I get frustrated, but I know it's part of the job, because it's kind of the magic that happens is making a movie or making a video versus the magic of solving a murder, and that. So.
And there's no less work going on in the background of a murder investigation than there is going on. If you look around this room right here, right now, the amount of assets it takes and the logistics to have a simple recorded conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And do you find one of the things that I would imagine is very difficult is when you had mentioned that obviously when things cool off in a murder case, obviously they're not as the engine's not revving as hard necessarily as it is if there's a hot lead or if there's a timing issue.
Right.
Would you say that it's difficult how hard is it to keep your emotions in check when you did find that first piece of evidence in 2018, I think you had said, when you found that, and now that case has picked up some speed again? How do you keep your emotions in check by not getting too high, not getting too low, and staying at an even keel? Does that play a role?
I think it does, and I think it really takes many years of experience in a venue like the Homicide Squad, where you've had that case, and it might be the simplest of cases that you were the first one to respond to the call for that. And you've gone and done the investigation, and you've resolved the case, arrested somebody, and then seen it through the court processes, which is 2/3 of the work after the arrest that needs to take place.
Someone could be sitting even before it goes to trial. You have people sitting still in prison for 2 years, 3 years before that even goes to trial. So there's a lot of work that has to go on in between. Yeah. But I imagine it is a bit of a roller coaster at certain times when there's a trial or a pre-trial, and there's a lot of up and down, a lot of emotional.
There's pre-trials. There's almost always a preliminary inquiry, which is like a mini trial, and there's a lot of work for a good 2-year period. They're trying to shrink that time between arrest and between going to trial as best as they can. But that is the bulk of the work after the fact, after that arrest, and then you team up with some dedicated Crown attorneys to present the best case you can in court, and that's an awful lot of work too.
Yeah.
And you might see some coverage at trial in the media. Rarely will they mention the investigators
kind of take a back
involved in the
seat
background. You do kind of take a back seat, but that is absolutely a tremendous amount of work. So until you've been through that process, and you can sit down in a case like the MacArthur case and visualize, here's what's going to be happening over the next 2-3 years, and here's what I have to make sure I account for and I'm responsible for. And that's really what you're thinking of when that day comes, when that evidence comes forward, right?
Yeah.
So the MacArthur case is a great example where you find this photograph of somebody on a computer who appears to be deceased, but you still don't have a body. And so our concern right there is, how do we prove that this person is deceased in this photograph? Sure looks deceased to me, but can I get a pathologist to look at this photograph and say this person's deceased?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Prove it.
So you're always considering that at every stage in your investigation. And that's something that Mark Saunders was phenomenal at too. The minute he picked up that phone for that murder call, he was already thinking ahead to the Crown's closing argument.
10 steps ahead.
Yeah.
I feel like you need to in order to be effective at that job.
To get the end result you want, and also to get, because not only do you guys have to, have the information and prove it out a little bit, but you also then have to go and get warrants. You have to go and get, to gain access to one's home and to gain valuables from people to kind of look through. So there's a lot of other things outside of that go along to it. And then also, how much does this play a role? So not only do you have to do the work for 2-3 years, but then you also have to deal with the cunning defense teams, right? And I know you know this because those guys are they're trying to find holes in the work that you've done. And because it's such a long period of time since the thing started, is there, how hard is it to fill those holes in and be prepared for that cross-examination from them?
There's no such thing as a perfect investigation where you're going to be able to plug up all those holes. And a good defense lawyer really will weave their way.
Work their way in, right?
In and around whatever you have, because remember, they've got complete disclosure of absolutely everything that you have.
Yeah.
And they'll try to punch holes in it and poke holes in it, right? And hopefully you have a strong enough case where you can still convict the accused.
Well, how does that feel, once it does go through and, things are said and done and it's finally closed? How does that feel for you and your team, inside and amount of work you've done over the years?
At what point in time? When the jury comes back with the guilty or not guilty?
Yeah.
It's very surreal because you expect a very happy feeling or a feeling of ecstasy when that comes back, and it's not like that. It's you're usually dead tired. You've been waiting for that jury for 4 or 5 days, for 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
You're sitting in the courtroom, and there's no high fives, and there's no clapping, and there's no applause. It's just guilty, not guilty. Okay, that's it.
It is what it is.
On to the next one, right?
And the next thing I wanted to bring up, you had already touched on it earlier, was Christine Jessup. I am actually from Mount Albert, Ontario, in East Gwillimbury, where Queensville is also within East Gwillimbury. And I was 4 years old at the time when she had passed. And I remember Guy Paul Moran, her neighbor, he was all over the place, but especially in the community of East Gwillimbury that had 20,000 people. And then now hearing that the case was solved so many years later, give us a little background about, what had happened back in '84 and what has transpired now recently in that case.
Well, I might be dating myself a little bit. I'm not quite, well, I'm not as young as you, but I'm not quite old enough. I mean, in 1984, I would have been 17 years old.
Listening to Bruce Springsteen.
Bruce Springsteen came on the scene at that time. We'll touch on that after.
Continue.
1984, in all 1985 Exhibition Stadium. Born in the USA tour, but I didn't make the 1984 shows. So in 1984, I can well imagine what was happening in 1984 with a missing girl out of York region.
Yeah.
a missing 9-year-old girl, and the search for her, not knowing what had happened, carry on for quite some time, and then her remains being found in Durham region.
That's right, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you've got that, and we still see it today. It's not a battle, but it's, okay, now you have two police services who are going to be responsible for this investigation. And I think we're much better at it today than we would have been back then. And you're looking at two relatively small jurisdictions where they might not have that experience
in homicide,
of dealing with a lot of murders. Right? Over my 15 years in homicide, where I've dealt with about 80 murders.
Wow.
And
that's a good point. Yeah.
Up there, they might be dealing with 2 or 3 a year at that point in time, right? They're a little busier now than they were back then. But I can imagine that was just a massive, massive investigation. And that would have been pre-Paul Bernardo as well. And we saw a review of the Paul Bernardo case years later, where they really took the handshaking of the different police services and committed it to a software platform with a little tiny bit of artificial intelligence back in those days. And that's grown and expanded as well. So, I'm not going to be critical or second guess anything that was done in 1984, because I'm sure a dedicated group of investigators investigating the murder of a 9-year-old child, and child murders are the absolute toughest murders to deal with investigatively to begin with.
How come?
They're very emotional, right?
Absolutely.
Extremely emotional. A lot of times it's, there's it's the parents or the guardians involved in it, so it's a matter of establishing exclusive opportunity and really relying a lot on medical evidence. But in a case like that, that's a tough case. And to be critical of guys who were working that case back in 1984, when really there was probably nothing more they wanted in their life to do than solve that case.
Yeah. And they didn't have the resource, not even close to the amount of resources that we have today, right?
Yeah. So I'm glad at the end of the day, we were able to do an awful lot of work to get that successful outcome. And there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered, and the guys are working around the clock on it still to dig back into that case.
And the person that was that they had said was the guilty party has been deceased for some time.
He died in 2015. And there's a real fine line, and here's a good example. Getting back to your earlier question, where you call him the guilty party. Yeah. He's never been found guilty in a court of law.
So I guess
right. So would we have had grounds to arrest him at this point in time? Yes, we're saying we would have had those grounds, right? Okay. So and that's as far as I'll go with that.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, it sounds like you're very busy, as of right now. What is it like to lead the largest, investigative unit for homicide in Canada, as well as, in a COVID environment? How is that? How are you dealing with that?
Oh, COVID's a very interesting hurdle in how we conduct day-to-day business, right? We can't stop doing what we do, but we have to make certain changes in how we do business, whether we rely on Zoom or other platforms to conduct interviews. Obviously, everyone's wearing masks and maintaining that social distancing.
Sure. I'm assuming that might possibly be less effective, being in the room. Like, could I see how you would interview Andy right now if he was a perp?
Please don't, Hank. Please don't.
Just a little bit.
Take the fifth, Andy.
I'll just take the fifth. Call my lawyer.
Use the American version. But what we're seeing right now, interestingly enough, and is trying to deal with these cases in court. right? And the
are they all
logistics
Zoom right now, or are they in person?
There's some that venues that are in person. There's some venues where they're using a courtroom adjacent to the main courtroom, and they're zooming in. There's some courtrooms where they're just using another office in the building and putting witnesses in there.
Got it.
But to walk into a courtroom in 2020 and seeing these plexiglass walls around the judges and the lawyers.
So strange.
It's very strange, and I think some lawyers have even commented, and I agree, well, this is probably something we should have been doing 10 or 15 years ago, right? Instead of, with having the court system, as one lawyer said, I remember in a TV interview, has been stuck in the 1970s. Yeah. Right? Why are we still doing things this way? Why are we bringing people in literally from anywhere in the world and transporting them here and putting them up in a hotel, and when it's your time to testify, then we'll bring you down to the courthouse, and that's it, when we can simply put them in front of a computer and
where you go,
have them provide their evidence that way, right? So interesting times.
Do you find so I know through speaking with some other officers who are friends of mine that during COVID, domestic cases have risen. Do you find that this is such a tough time playing on people's mental health? Do you find that homicides has increased, or even maybe due to shortage at the border for drugs? Do you feel that COVID has played any role in an increase or decrease of homicides?
It's an interesting question, because we've had this discussion, and you see in the newspapers and in the media that homicide rates have been going up in different jurisdictions, and in particular in regards to domestics and mental health issues. Yeah. And we haven't really seen it in Toronto.
Oh, okay.
We've had some pretty awful mental health / domestic related homicides this year.
Okay.
But I don't believe it's anything higher than what we would normally have. So
fairly standard year to year then.
Pretty standard, and you do see a lot of strain on a lot of people because of COVID, but I don't see it affecting the homicide rate.
Well, what's your prediction for the winter? Everybody's saying that once everything is closed and things are cold, I think, my mom works at the hospital, and she's telling me I'm already seeing all the mental health cases down in Sinai are, skyrocketing, and we can only imagine what winter's going to look like. From your professional opinion, do you think things could happen more in the winter as people are more closed in and, people are locked in?
It's hard to say. I mean, Trump has promised a vaccine, hasn't he?
Yeah, it's in the mail.
Yeah, so maybe it'll depend on the American election. I really don't know. I really think Toronto's such a great city, and we tend to be pretty good when it comes to, put a mask on. And
protect
people
yourself
are
and
put on the masks. And I think, we're getting some really good information updates multiple times a day as to best practices, and some good leadership and some good guidance. And hopefully, we're all panicking back in March with really terrible situation in the province, but not nearly as bad as we've seen in other countries, and even just south of the border of us. I think we've done pretty good so far, and hopefully over the course of this winter we keep that course.
Absolutely.
Now, for the just out of sheer curiosity, for the interviews, that wouldn't be Zoom. I would imagine that would be a little bit more what you'd want. That would that make a difference in an interview? The personal setting, would it be more beneficial to be in front of that person, to watch body language and gestures?
It would be, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you change your background to make it seem more mysterious? I would.
I don't think there would be any cave or space background.
Just like 5 of your faces looking right at the perp, and a little more intense.
I only just figured out how to change my background recently. So
we would do one as a joke where I would have me walking, and then it would be myself walking and peeking in to my face, and people would be like, "What's going on?"
That's definitely strange.
Yeah. Now, I'm glad we're laughing, and I think that's one thing I want to talk about is, how do you I mean, you've seen so many things from, you know, I mean, I couldn't even imagine things we couldn't even think of. How do you take that home? You know, you have a wife and kid, you know, what's that look like on how you de-stress? Or what's your process on how you either leave it at home or do you take it with you? How does that work?
I think, and generally speaking, you do need that strong home support system. You know, I was very fortunate that my wife stayed at home after my daughter was born, so I didn't have to worry that much about scheduling and whatnot. And after 15 years working these murders, I don't think it rolls off my back by any stretch. I'm sure I'm deeply damaged, quite frankly, as Megan will attest. You and me both, Hank,
just from the tech industry.
If anybody's listening and you won't see his face right now, he can give a pretty straight face. And as he says he's damaged, it just makes me laugh even further. I just want people to know that. Go ahead.
But you do absolutely have to, have that strong support network behind you. We've got also a very good organization here when it comes to mental health, and we're getting better and better as time goes on. And you need to have those outlets, and keep yourself busy away from work, and no one shut it off.
That's another important thing I think to add here is, you know, what do you do because I think a big part of maintaining mental health, whether it's exercise, whether it's, you know, watching 48 Hours or Halloween or whatever it might be, what are some things that you do to kind of, you know, make sure that you are switching off properly and you've allotted a certain amount of time? Do you have a calendar, a schedule in terms of shutting off? Or do you just feel that you need to shut off, and then what kind of activities do you typically do?
I think your days off really should be your days off. I'm in a bit of a different situation now as the inspector, where I can't shut that phone off. But when I was the detective sergeant running one of the investigative teams, if one of my guys called me while they were on vacation and started talking work, I'd say, you're on vacation. Yeah. Turn your phone off, right?
Get lost.
And don't watch the news. And turn it back on Sunday night before you're going to come back in on Monday morning. But you do have to have those outlets, and I'm fortunate. I've always had some sort of physical activity to fall back on, right? I played a lot of basketball when I was younger, and then the knees gave out, and I switched to cycling.
Well, the height gave it away. I didn't think you were. I didn't think you were a jockey.
I feel like you could still cross me over one. I don't know. I wouldn't doubt it.
I love doing it, and I would get out 3 or 4 times a week and just hit the hard court. And in my mid-30s, I couldn't do it anymore. And, you know, I picked up a basketball a few times with my daughter as she was growing up. And I even run into some of my old basketball buddies, and they're like, "Oh, come on out. We're all in our 50s, right? We're a little slower, a little older." I'm like, "No, I've had 3 knee surgeries. I'm not going to put any more pounding on that, right, or re-injure it." So I find road bike cycling is my thing now, and I get out pretty much every day and just get on the bike for an hour. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. 100K and back, do a century
100K. I've done a couple of metric centuries. I've never done an imperial century, which would be 160K.
Wow.
It's a lot of.
I complain about walking 5K.
Yeah, that's a lot of pedaling, but I'll do 30-ish every morning, and on the weekend maybe go for 70 or 80.
You're a big dude too, so that's why, you know,
I'm a slow and I'm a slow cyclist. It takes me a lot longer to do that than most people.
What about the Peloton? I know that Deputy Shauna Coxon has a Peloton that she's been raving about. Have you looked into the Peloton? We should almost get a paid ad for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, Deputy Coxon had one. Chief Saunders had one, and I think he still does. And
you watch Halloween on there while you're biking. You know?
Yeah, could run away from Mike Myers if you had to.
Right now, my bike is in my office. It's on a smart trainer, and I use a program called Zwift. For winter training. So I'm still on there every morning at 6 a.m. doing 45 minutes to an hour of riding.
So routine is a big...
So it's very much like the Peloton.
Okay,
right?
And you find routine. So basically in all of these, in the cycling and just routine, you're probably a beast of routine just because of your job. But do you find in terms of setting these activities out and just kind of being on a consistent routine is important? Or do you like to switch it up a little bit so it's not so mundane?
No, routine makes it more achievable, I think.
Yeah.
If this is the first year where I've actually set the bike up here at work for the winter, whereas before I would set it up at home and think, okay, I'm going to hop on the bike at 4:00 in the afternoon when I get home. No,
never happens,
right? So if you set that time slot, and I think that's very important especially for forms of exercise, set that time slot, stay committed to it. And even mornings like this morning where my sleep was interrupted a couple of times last night, and I was dead tired when I got in here, and I thought, oh, it's 6:00. I'm still going to go on that
then
bike.
It's interview time.
Yeah.
I mean, you had so many years of experience here, and now you kind of know the groove, to take that time for your mental health break. Do you think a lot of the younger people in the force who are just getting in there and just want to drive it home and, work all hours of the night, do you think they handle it as well? Or do you give them ever advice to say, hey, like you said to one of your colleagues, get off the phone, to your vacation?
Regularly.
Yeah.
And the exercise is a great example of that, where even in the Homicide squad, we have guys who come into the office and it's taken them years and they've wanted to be there for so long. And yes, they finally get in and their work ethic is through the roof.
Yeah.
And they don't set that time aside.
Burnout rate would probably.
Yeah, it tires you out. So you really have to promote the healthy eating, the wellness, and the exercise.
Absolutely.
With these guys, right? So
well, that's good. You take care of your team. I think that's the main thing. And
I try to.
That's
right. And I try to be a positive influence. Right? They come in, and if they're in at 6:45 and they hear that buzzing sound from the boss's office because he's on his bike, and I've had numerous officers come and go from the office, and by the time they leave, they're on a road bike.
Yeah.
Right? Because they've picked it up while they're there.
Well, I'm sure everything. All the officers are affected very differently when it comes to dealing with homicide cases. Now, the idea of mortality. How's that changed since you started in law enforcement, and where you are now in terms of the meaning of death and things like that? How has that changed? As you've been on the job. Stumped in my interview question. My stumped interview question came in.
I can't say anyone's ever gone down that road before about my beliefs when it comes to mortality. And I suppose, remember, I started on this job. I was not even 22 years old yet. So with a very, very narrow vision of life and the world. And after 31 years now, including coming up on 16 years in homicide, I think it certainly expands your scope about death and dealing with death. But I don't know that it really changes your emotions when it comes to death on a personal level.
Because it's still personal. Right?
It's still personal, and I've I lost my parents in the last 5 years, and I've lost a couple of friends just in this calendar year, and it's still emotional and it's still tough to deal with when you're dealing with death at a homicide scene where you don't know that person yet, although you do get to know them through your investigation.
And their family as well.
Yeah, and sometimes you can develop those very strange bonds with that victim, even though you've never met them. And but you just get to know them so well through your investigation. But at the outset, it's a different animal to deal with than a personal attachment to someone who's died.
Absolutely. I mean, right? I feel like that's how you stay sane too, right? You're gonna leave. This is, to put it quite bluntly, this is work death, and this is personal. You know, things that I have to deal with just because it's life. I can absolutely, that makes a lot of sense, from how I see things. That's very great to know. And in terms of the community around you, and just to like kind of move off the topic, I'm sure a lot of people are empathetic about these victims too, as we watch it on TV. How is the community actually, has it aided in the investigation process, in terms of what you look for any more evidence or any leads or things like that, like in terms of the community providing you any help?
Some of the biggest factors in the success of the outcome of a homicide investigation is the help from the community, and what you get. I've said it time and time again that we can't do this alone, right? And putting together a good homicide case and a good homicide investigation is like putting together a massive jigsaw puzzle. Sure. And everyone's got that little piece, and somebody might have 99% of those pieces, and then just a little bit has to be filled in, but we need those pieces. And overall, and I've said it already, I think the city of Toronto is a great city where people don't want to see death on the streets and an increased homicide rate. And, these bullets flying the way they've been flying over the last couple of years. So we get an awful lot of help from the community, a lot of it unsung. But there's a lot going on in the background, and a lot of people willing to step up and help out any way they can.
And on the other side of that, too, I would imagine, especially in the MacArthur case, I think the level of fear builds up in the community, and sometimes that fear comes back to you guys in a negative fashion, wanting results faster. And so what's that fine line and that buffer between, keeping everyone calm and at bay, getting help from them, and kind of playing in the middle and that balancing act? Yeah,
you have to balance that, preserving the integrity of that investigation with, public safety, though, trumps that every single time. So you want to get as much out as you possibly can get out, but you also, remember with MacArthur, a lot of people were saying, we knew there was a serial killer, and we told you there was a serial killer. And we had those same discussions in the project room. Maybe there's a serial killer. Could there be a serial killer? Yeah.
And they don't see that.
You can't put that. You can't put that out there, right? Because what if it isn't a serial killer?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And the fear level goes up, and
the fear level goes up, and the best we could do at certain points in time, and I always go back to June of 2013, where we had these 3 missing men. And we didn't know what had happened to them, and we put that out there and asked for some help, and we got a lot of good information, a lot of good tips that came in over the ensuing year. And at the end of the day, MacArthur was a conniving, sadistic killer who disposed of his bodies rather effectively. To the point, and was very careful in choosing his victims. And when a little bit of heat was on him, he chose his victims even more carefully, right? So we're not magicians, and we can't just manufacture evidence or anything like that. And at the end of the day, I'm just glad that we got him.
Yeah, right? And I think we are too, and I think we're very glad, the amount of work and time you put, not just you, but your family, to keeping you, sane and doing your thing, and having that support, and as well as Toronto Police, on your back too. So
you and your team, fantastic job, and
great.
Thank you.
Great team. So thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to say to the community, to your fellow colleagues, before we wrap up the show?
Really. To my colleagues and to the community, although MacArthur was a big case, and I'm the face that everybody seems to know, recognize and associate with MacArthur. There was an awful lot of police officers and civilian employees of this service doing an awful lot of work behind those scenes that never got recognized, and to them, we owe them a great deal of thanks for the amount of work they do, and that's true in every homicide investigation, where you might see one detective sergeant in front of the news cameras talking about it, but there's a whole team behind him doing him or her doing an awful lot of work behind the scenes. So,
amazing.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Hank,
you
for
so
joining
much.
us.
thank you, guys.
24 Shades of Blue, everybody. We're out.